Listen closely, because what I'm about to tell you was never meant for your ears. A secret older than America itself, buried in the frozen woods of Maine, where three women built a stone sanctuary so perfectly designed for horror that even God seemed to avert his eyes. They called it the Convent of Eternal Tears, but locals knew it by another name, the Ashford Curse. It begins with a single, undeniable truth. 600 women went in, fewer than half returned. Those who did came back empty, like something essential had been cut out of them. And tonight, you and I are going to uncover every dark corner of what really happened behind those stone walls. You're not just going to hear this story, you're going to feel it, down to the marrow of your bones. Because the Ashford sisters weren't fanatics, nor simple criminals, they were something worse. Brilliant, calculating minds who understood the power of psychology centuries before anyone else dared whisper the word. They saw the human soul as something that could be broken, reshaped, and sold, all under the guise of salvation. And they built their fortress in a land so remote that screams could echo through endless forest without ever reaching another living soul. This isn't just history. It's a forbidden record of how madness can be manufactured, how obedience can be engineered, and how entire generations can be warped by those who wield knowledge like a scalpel. By the end of this journey, you will see the world differently. You will question what you've been taught about control, faith, and the invisible hands pulling your strings. But right now, in these first few minutes, remember one thing. Once you hear these truths, you can never go back. Because the Ashford curse was never truly buried. It simply learned to hide in plain sight. And tonight, you're going to stare it straight in the eye and discover what it means to carry the legacy of madness. The Ashford women arrived in the dying light of an October evening, their horse-drawn carriage creaking across the frost-bitten earth like a hearse delivering doom. Mother Superior. Agatha stepped down first, tall, regal, her silver-streaked hair catching the last red rays of the sun like a crown of ice. Her eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the rough settlement of Millbridge as though measuring it for a coffin. She moved with the certainty of someone who had planned every detail long before her arrival. Behind her came Sister Prudence, thin and ghostly pale, her hands gloved in black kid leather despite the cold, hiding the surgeon's precision they would soon reveal. Last was Novice Temperance, a vision of unsettling beauty, with eyes so dark they seemed bottomless, reflecting a hunger not for faith, but for domination. They claimed to be Anglican nuns, fleeing persecution in England, but their papers were forgeries, masterpieces of deception that fooled every church elder they presented them to. They spoke of founding a sanctuary for wayward women, and the men of Millbridge, desperate for any civilizing influence in their lawless frontier, eagerly welcomed them. Within days, the sisters purchased 200 acres of dense forest, paying 3 times the land's worth in gold coins that glinted with a history no one dared question. They commanded the town's masons and carpenters to build a stone convent with walls thicker than any church and windows so small no soul inside could glimpse the world beyond. The basement, they insisted, needed deeper excavation than any cellar the workers had ever seen, a labyrinthine warren of stone corridors and sealed chambers that would swallow sound like a grave. When asked about these strange demands, Agatha's answer was simple, serene, and chilling. True penitence requires isolation. A soul must be stripped of all distraction. It is to be remade. And so the foundation was laid, not only of stone, but of a legacy of silence, secrets, and suffering. The Ashford women had not come to heal. They had come to hunt. And the forest would soon whisper of women who vanished forever within those gray walls, of screams that rose only to be smothered in shadows, and of a curse that would never die. As winter tightened its grip around Millbridge, the convent rose stone by cold stone, like a mausoleum for the living. The Ashford sisters oversaw every detail with a fervor that unsettled even the most hardened laborers. They demanded reinforced doors of iron-banded oak, hinges that wouldn't squeal, and locks crafted to resist any pry bar or desperate fist. They ordered ventilation shafts cunningly hidden in the thick walls, wide enough to carry soundless drafts, narrow enough that nothing human could crawl through. And then there were the drainage channels, carved with such precision they could funnel away gallons of liquid in moments. The builders assumed they were for washing floors or disposing of kitchen refuse. they were wrong. Evening saw the sisters wandering the half-finished halls, candles in hand, whispering in languages no one recognized, tongues that sent shivers down the spines of those who dared eavesdrop. Some swore they heard snatches of Latin, others something older, a guttural dialect like stones grinding in the dark. The town's circuit physician, Dr. Samuel Hartwell, was the first outsider to earn the sisters' trust, or so he believed. Drawn by rumors of their advanced methods, he arrived with his leather satchel and polite skepticism. But his doubts melted when Agatha spoke of hysteria not as sin, but as a curable disorder, offering treatments far beyond the crude bleeding and opiates he'd learned in Boston. She promised him knowledge to rival the best minds of Europe, a partnership to advance medicine itself. And so Hartwell became their willing accomplice, providing laudanum, scalpels, and silence. In his journals, he marveled at their techniques. He never wrote of the smell that lingered in their halls, that metallic tang that clung to his nostrils long after he left, nor the hollow eyes of women he glimpsed shuffling through candlelit coves, or riders, heads bowed like convicts awaiting execution. The Ashford women were building more than a convent. They were erecting a factory of obedience, a fortress where the walls themselves would remember the cries of every spirit they broke. And outside, the forest watched silently, snow burying each secret one flake at a time. Spring came late to the Maine wilderness, but with the thaw arrived the first true whispers of the Ashford curse. Local families, desperate to rid themselves of rebellious daughters or wives who questioned authority, began sending them to the convent of eternal tears. Some women were left at the convent gates in the dead of night, bundled like parcels, their tear-streaked faces glimpsed only by flickering lantern light. The Ashford sisters accepted them all, smiling serenely as they signed receipts for payment, silver dollars exchanged for souls. Mothers returned home whispering prayers of relief. Fathers walked taller in town, confident that scandal and shame had been spirited away. But what truly awaited those women behind stone walls was not salvation, but submission forged through terror. The convent's first floor housed the novices, those who still clung to defiance, placed under constant watch and subjected to endless cycles of isolation, deprivation, and whispered catechisms that eroded will. The second floor was for the compliant, who moved through daily rituals with eerie precision, repeating prayers until they sounded less like devotion than the droning of insects. The third floor, always locked, remained a mystery even to Dr. Hartwell. When asked, Agatha's gray eyes grew darker, and she would simply say, "The third floor is where souls find their final peace." By now, the Ashfords' reputation had spread far beyond Millbridge. Carriages from as far as Portsmouth arrived with troubled women and sacks of coin. But none of those who left their loved ones behind ever saw the inside of the convent. Once the doors closed, the Ashfords alone dictated reality, and they crafted a world of relentless darkness. Reports began to trickle into town of women returning home weeks or months later with empty eyes, unable to speak of what had happened. They would sit for hours, staring at walls, hands folding and unfolding as if searching for orders. Others never came back at all, and were quietly declared lost to consumption or fevers. Yet no funeral processions ever left the convent, and no graves were seen in the forest. The Ashford sisters had become high priestesses of a cult of silence, their convent a fortress where the line between healing and horror blurred beyond recognition. On a moonless night in early June, a storm howled through the black pines around the convent, lightning clawing the sky like the anger of forgotten gods. Within the stone walls, screams rose and fell like a choir of the damned, muffled but unmistakable to those who dared listen near the forest's edge. It was on such a night that Thomas Brewster, barely 20 and already seasoned by the cruel realities of frontier life, decided he needed proof of what he had long suspected. He crept through the forest, rain soaking him to the bone, each thunderclap masking his approach. Slipping to the rear of the convent, he found himself drawn to the faint, flickering light that leaked from a narrow basement window half buried in mud and roots. What he saw shattered every notion of God and mercy he had carried since childhood. Inside, 3 women worked with the calm precision of butchers. Temperance readied scalpels and saws on a tray lined with black velvet. Prudence loomed over a table where a bound woman thrashed, her mouth stuffed with rags to silence her screams, and Agatha watched from the shadows, scribbling notes in a ledger with a look of cold satisfaction. The patient's head was shaved, a cross carved into her scalp, blood mingled with rain leaking through the cracked ceiling, dripping rhythmically like a metronome of suffering. Prudence moved with expert detachment, opening the skull with a hand steadier than any physician Thomas had ever known. There was no hesitancy, no reverence, only a hunger to lay bare the mind, to reach inside and rearrange what made a person whole. Thomas's breath fogged the glass as he watched in paralyzed horror. Then Agatha looked up, eyes meeting his through the darkness and rain, and in that instant he felt something inside him shatter. He fled blindly, crashing through branches, lungs burning, ears ringing with phantom screams that would haunt his nights until death. And as he stumbled into Millbridge at dawn, raving of torture and unholy rites, the town faced a choice: accept the horror now revealed, or bury it deeper than the roots of the forest. For some truths are so monstrous that to believe them is to risk one's own sanity. And the Ashford sisters knew exactly how to turn that fear into a weapon. Thomas Brewster's wild-eyed testimony exploded like a spark in dry tinder. The townsfolk gathered in tight knots outside the blacksmith's forge, their whispers crawling through Millbridge like a rising tide of dread. Some called him mad, driven insane by a night spent in storm and darkness. Others, older and wiser, looked at the haunted emptiness in Thomas's eyes and felt a shiver crawl up their spines. But fear of the Ashford sisters' influence was stronger than the urge for justice. For 5 years, these women had cultivated an aura of untouchable sanctity, weaving themselves into the town's lifeblood with generous donations to the church and unwavering public piety. They had midwives in their pocket, merchants grateful for their coin, and a circuit physician who sang their praises as if they were saints. Even the town's moral compass, Deacon Morrison, hesitated. He understood the catastrophic fallout if Thomas's accusations proved true. Families would demand answers for their missing daughters, the fragile peace of a harsh frontier settlement would shatter, and Millbridge itself might become a byword for scandal and depravity. And so, a deadly silence settled over the town. People avoided the convent in daylight, crossing the street rather than greet the sisters in their rare public appearances. By night, parents kept their children inside as the wind carried faint, desperate cries from the forest. Sounds they forced themselves to call imagination. In secret, Deacon Morrison arranged a visit to the convent, hoping to uncover the truth without sparking hysteria. He found Agatha waiting for him, serene and smiling, in a parlor heavy with the scent of lavender and candle wax. She spoke softly of spiritual interventions, of women possessed by unholy urges, of the sacred duty to cure them by any means necessary. Her words slithered into his mind, each syllable laced with the power of absolute certainty. By the end of their meeting, Morrison staggered out into the pale dawn, mind clouded by a poisonous mixture of horror and reluctant belief. He tried to tell himself the sisters' methods were harsh but holy, that salvation sometimes required blood and pain. And in that fragile self-deception, the Ashford sisters found their greatest ally, a community so terrified of the truth that it would rather sacrifice its daughters than face the abyss. As spring melted into a stifling summer, the Ashford sisters' power over Millbridge grew absolute, fed by fear, secrecy, and the desperate complicity of parents who would rather silence their own doubts than admit the horror they had purchased. Carriages arrived under moonlight, bearing women whose families could no longer tolerate them, wives who challenged their husbands, daughters who refused arranged marriages, or women who simply hungered for knowledge beyond needlework and scripture. Each was greeted with soft words and gentle hands at the convent gates, then led inside to a labyrinth where kindness turned to cold calculation. The convent's upper floors became a training ground for perfect obedience, days structured with military precision, hours spent reciting prayers until voices cracked, and nights haunted by soft footsteps outside dormitory doors, reminders that the sisters were always watching. Those who resisted were sent below. The basement, hidden beneath 3 stories of stone, became a cathedral of agony. There, Sister Prudence refined her methods with ruthless innovation, experimenting on the mind as if it were a puzzle to be solved with blades and needles. She drilled into skulls to let out sin, severed nerves to erase memories, and used ice baths to induce a pliant catatonia mistaken by outsiders for divine peace. All the while, Agatha recorded every experiment with obsessive detail, her ledger filling with case studies that read like recipes for dehumanization. Temperance, the youngest, moved between patients like a ghost, whispering reassurances in a voice as soothing as it was hollow. Her beauty disarmed those in their final moments of resistance, her black eyes reflecting the flickering lamplight like pools of polished obsidian. And still, the townspeople told themselves it was all necessary, that the strange silence that settled over once defiant women was proof of spiritual healing. They ignored the missing, explained away sudden deaths, and accepted the heavy wagons that occasionally rolled into the forest at dawn, their cargo hidden beneath tarps soaked dark with something that wasn't rain. For the Ashford sisters had learned the simplest, darkest truth of power, that if you control what people fear, you control what they choose to see. And in Millbridge, everyone had chosen blindness over the unbearable light of truth. The deeper the Ashford sisters dug their roots into Millbridge, the more their methods evolved from crude cruelty into a terrifying science of the soul. By midsummer, the convent's basement had transformed into a labyrinthine warren of cells, each crafted for a different stage of breaking. The walls were lined with iron rings for restraints, and drains in the stone floors ensured the sisters could wash away the evidence of even the most violent sessions. Dr. Hartwell, once a respected frontier physician, now spent most nights at the convent. He watched and learned as Agatha guided him through procedures that made his medical texts seem like fairy tales. Together, they perfected a regimen of laudanum-induced trances, bleedings of the mind, where small holes were drilled into skulls to release supposed humors of rebellion, and endless cycles of sleep deprivation to render patients as malleable as clay. The sisters tested the limits of terror and compliance, developing a system so effective it could fracture even the strongest spirit. Once a woman's will was broken, she was taught a new identity crafted by Agatha's precise words, a persona obedient, docile, and grateful for her healing. Those who failed to accept this new self, who screamed through their bindings or tried to claw out their eyes to escape the visions induced by laudanum, were taken to a hidden chamber deeper than the rest. There, in a place the sisters called the Sanctum of Silence, Prudence worked in absolute secrecy. No one returned from the sanctum, and no trace of those women ever emerged. Outside, rumors swirled but never took shape. The Ashfords kept the town lulled with charitable gifts and strategic displays of piety. They hosted prayer vigils where Agatha's sermons spoke of moral decay and the need for radical correction. Townspeople nodded along, comforted by the illusion that evil could be cut away like a cancer. And so, the Ashford sisters perfected a machine of control, a cycle of terror, submission, and hollow rebirth. Every time a father dropped his daughter at the convent gates with trembling hands and a hopeful heart, the sisters sharpened their blades, and the forest grew thick with secrets, roots twisted around bones no one would ever find. By autumn's arrival, the Ashford sisters had woven themselves so thoroughly into Millbridge's lifeblood that even the bravest souls hesitated to speak ill of them. Whispers of the convent's true purpose drifted through taverns and church pews like phantom smoke, but each time someone dared voice suspicion, they were met with sharp, fearful eyes and urgent shushing. For to question the Ashfords was to question the safety of the entire town, the respectability of its most prominent families, and the illusion that some sins could be erased with coin and prayer. Meanwhile, the sisters expanded their reach beyond Millbridge. Word spread among wealthy merchants in Boston and Portsmouth that a miraculous institution in the Maine wilderness could cure a rebellious wife or cleanse a daughter of dangerous ideas. Carriages began arriving from distant cities, bearing pale women with tear-streaked faces and fathers with pockets heavy with silver. Each arrival tightened the sisters' grip on power. Each departure, or unexplained disappearance, deepened the darkness at the heart of their empire. Inside the convent, methods grew ever more refined. Temperance's soft voice lulled patients into trusting dreams. Prudence's steady hands opened minds like clockwork mechanisms, and Agatha's chilling sermons wove guilt so intricately into the women's hearts, they began to believe they deserved every cut, every shock, every night chained in darkness. Women who emerged from months in the convent returned to their families with perfect manners and empty eyes, praising the sisters for saving them while speaking in tones stripped of any spark of individuality. But sometimes, in the dead of night, they would wake screaming, clawing at phantom restraints only they could feel. The forest grew quiet as winter crept in, blanketing the land in a silence so deep it seemed the world itself was complicit. Who strayed too close to the convent at night reported seeing shadowy figures moving through the snow, dragging burdens that left no trace come morning. And above it all, the Ashford sisters stood watch at their windows, silver hair and dark eyes gleaming in candlelight, certain in the knowledge that fear, more than any blade, was their sharpest weapon. The Ashford curse was no longer a rumor. It was a legacy, binding Millbridge in a pact of silence that would outlive them all. As the snow thickened and night swallowed the sun before supper, a new phase of the Ashford sisters' dominion began. Women who returned from the convent seemed to carry the curse outward like a contagion. Their presence in Millbridge transformed every room they entered. Conversations hushed, laughter died, and men found themselves staring into eyes that seemed to look right through them. These women moved with eerie synchrony, their words clipped and polite, their gestures mechanical, as if pieces of their souls had been neatly carved away. Some husbands and fathers were pleased, praising the sisters for restoring order, but a few noticed details they dared not speak aloud. Wives who flinched at unexpected noises, daughters who stared at mirrors for hours, touching their temples with trembling fingers as if searching for wounds no one could see. In the convent, the sisters had begun experimenting with new techniques Agatha called deep penance. Dr. Hartwell recorded how they pioneered isolation tanks filled with icy water to induce hallucinations, a method they claimed revealed the darkest corners of the patient's mind. Women emerged from these tanks barely conscious, eyes rolling back, whimpering prayers to saints they had never learned. Then came the correction sermons. Hours of Agatha's hypnotic voice recounting their failures, repeated until the women parroted back every accusation as truth. The convent itself took on a life of its own, the stone walls seeming to hum with the agony of all they had contained. Servants who cleaned the halls reported footsteps echoing where no one walked, and shadows sliding across walls even when candles were still. They dared not speak of it. The price for gossip was a quiet dismissal, or worse, a sudden invitation to spend a night in the convent's upper floors, from which none returned unchanged. Meanwhile, Agatha's ledgers grow, fat with notes on every woman who entered, their weaknesses, their final breaking points. These records became her Bible, a guide to controlling not just individuals, but entire bloodlines, because the Ashford sisters understood a terrible secret. To truly master a community, you don't need to control everyone. You only need to break those who dare resist, so the rest will fall in line from fear alone. As the first snows of December hardened into an unbroken crust of ice over Millbridge, the convent became a fortress of shadows. The Ashford sisters had achieved what few tyrants ever could. They had convinced an entire town to surrender its conscience in exchange for the illusion of peace. Parents who once wept over rebellious daughters now sent them to the convent with grim pride, speaking of salvation in brittle tones that betrayed their dread. And yet, the more women they consigned to the stone halls, the more Millbridge itself began to rot from the inside. Shops closed early, the church bell rang hollow, and laughter vanished from taverns. It was as if the land itself recoiled from the darkness that seeped outward like ink in water. Within the convent, the Ashfords' experiments reached new depths of depravity. Sister Prudence refined a method called the benediction, a series of electrostatic shocks delivered through copper rods claimed to purge impure thoughts. Women convulsed under her calm gaze, the scent of scorched hair mingling with candle wax as Temperance whispered false promises of relief. When consciousness returned, they awoke pliant, memories softened like wax before a flame. Some families wrote letters demanding proof of life from loved ones who had disappeared for months. These letters were intercepted by Temperance, who forged careful replies in a familiar hand, assuring parents of steady progress. All the while, their daughters languished in darkness or worse. Meanwhile, Agatha expanded her reach beyond Millbridge, discreetly contacting powerful men in Boston who feared scandal as much as they craved control. She offered them the convent's services in exchange for patronage, creating a secret network of influence that stretched across New England like a spider's web. Soon, carriages bearing crests of old money rolled quietly into the forest, delivering women who would never be spoken of again. And yet, the Ashford sisters didn't just crave wealth or power. What they pursued was the perfect method, a formula of fear, pain, and ritual that could reduce any spirit to dust. Each broken woman brought them closer to that dark alchemy, and high in her chamber each night, Agatha knelt before an altar not of God, but of her own ambition, whispering prayers that no divine ear would ever hear, for she had given her soul long ago to something far older and hungrier than any saint. Winter's icy hand gripped Millbridge without mercy, sealing the town beneath a shell of silence. In that frozen gloom, the Ashford sisters thrived. The cold became their ally, the snowdrifts their shroud. Fewer travelers passed through, fewer questions were asked, and the world outside the convent seemed to forget Millbridge even existed. Inside the stone fortress, Agatha's sermons grew longer, each word sinking deeper into the minds of those unfortunate enough to hear them. She began to speak of generational cleansing, a chilling doctrine asserting that sin was carried in bloodlines and could only be purged through suffering. Families with histories of defiance were singled out, their women taken for extended penance in the convent's lower levels. Dr. Hartwell dutifully recorded these special cases, his quill scratching out details of lineage and suspected hereditary corruption. The Ashfords' experiments reflected this new obsession. Sister Prudence pioneered ancestral therapies, rituals of humiliation and isolation designed to convince women they were tainted from birth. Each day, they were forced to recite the supposed sins of their mothers and grandmothers until the guilt felt like a weight crushing their ribs. Nights in the basement grew more terrible. Women were made to kneel in pitch darkness for hours, hearing only Agatha's voice recounting the failings of their ancestors in a hypnotic monotone. In these endless vigils, even the strongest minds splintered, and the Ashfords rejoiced in their success. Yet despite the terror, a few townspeople began to sense something fundamentally wrong. Hunters found small burial mounds in the woods, half hidden by snow, where animals dug up bones that looked unsettlingly human. The town's gravedigger, a stooped man with a stutter, confided to his wife that he hadn't dug a fresh grave for any convent death in years. But sometimes, in the dead of night, he saw cloaked figures dragging shrouded shapes into the forest. These flickers of suspicion threatened the sisters' empire, but Agatha moved swiftly, whispering poison into the ears of influential men who would suffer ruin if the truth came out. And so rumors died as quickly as they arose, smothered by fear and the unspoken pact that the Ashford sisters' secret was safer left buried beneath the snow. By late January, Millbridge had become a village of watchful eyes and hushed words, every home a prison of unspoken terror. Those who still remembered the town's laughter before the Ashfords' arrival could only cling to the memories, like fragile flames flickering in a storm. Children were taught not to wander near the convent, to keep their eyes lowered when the sisters passed in town. Even the church grew quieter, its pews emptier each Sunday, as if God himself had turned his gaze away from a place that reeked of secrets. Inside the convent, the Ashford sisters began their most ambitious undertaking yet. The sanctum of generations, a hidden chamber deeper than any cell, carved into the bedrock beneath the convent's oldest wing. Lit only by guttering lanterns, the walls were etched with prayers rewritten as curses, each word designed to break a woman's sense of self. Here, Agatha gathered those she deemed most stubborn, women who clung to reason, who resisted even after weeks of torment. The sanctum was her crucible, a place where she could test methods she dared not reveal to even Dr. Hartwell. Temperance assisted with unnerving devotion, her soft words lulling captives into a daze before the real horrors began. Simulated burials in coffins too small to straighten one's limbs, forcing panic to bloom like rot, water starvation until hallucinations blurred reality, and elaborate staged confessions where other captives were forced to accuse each other of sins they never committed. Through it all, Agatha observed, refined, recorded, her notes growing into a manifesto of control so precise it bordered on dark genius. Meanwhile, the town's men fell deeper into the sisters' thrall. Agatha's promises of absolute obedience from their wives and daughters seduced those who feared losing authority in their own homes. Each father or husband who accepted this unholy bargain tightened the Ashfords' grip on Milbridge's heart. Yet outside, beyond the ring of lanterns and guards, the forest waited, ancient and indifferent. Wolves prowled the edges of the Ashfords' domain, their eyes glinting in the moonlight as if they alone knew the truth, that beneath the convent's stone and prayer lay a hunger for power that would consume everything, unless someone dared break the silence. The cold deepened, turning Milbridge's river into a ribbon of black ice and sealing the forest in a silence broken only by the mournful howl of wolves. In this frozen purgatory, the Ashford sisters' reign reached its most insidious phase, for Agatha had learned that true control was not won through open violence, but through subtle, relentless erosion of hope. By now, even the bravest villagers lowered their eyes when passing the convent's looming gates. Mothers who once doubted the sisters' methods now spoke of them with hollow reverence, repeating Agatha's words like gospel. "Better broken than damned," they would whisper to each other, convincing themselves that terror was the price of salvation. Inside the sanctum of generations, the sisters perfected new methods of psychological warfare. Prudence discovered that forcing captives to watch others suffer broke spirits faster than direct torture. She created mirrored punishments, lining walls with polished copper sheets so that every scream, every sobbing plea reflected endlessly back upon the victim. Those who refused to speak or confess were made to sit in total darkness, listening to recordings of themselves begging for mercy, a twisted echo that unraveled minds like thread. Meanwhile, Temperance cultivated her role as the convent's angelic face. She would greet new arrivals with soft songs and gentle caresses, calming their terror long enough to lower their guard. Yet behind her doe-eyed gaze lay an uncanny ability to spot the precise moment when a woman's resistance cracked. She would press a kiss to a captive's forehead, a tender gesture masking the sister's triumph as another soul fell into obedience. In the village, a few tried to flee, families who loaded wagons under moonlight, desperate to escape the suffocating dread that hung over Milbridge. But they never reached the nearest port. Days later, their horses were found wandering near the forest's edge, eyes wild, traces of blood frozen on their flanks. No sign of the families themselves was ever discovered. And so the lesson spread. There was no escape from the Ashfords' reach. As snow fell in endless drifts, the convent's chimneys belched black smoke into the pale sky, a silent signal to all who dared doubt. The Ashford sisters had no mercy, and no one would ever be allowed to leave their darkness unchanged. As February's storms lashed the Maine wilderness, turning the forest into a maze of ice-crusted branches, the Ashford sisters reveled in the cover of endless blizzards. Snow muffled every scream, swallowed every footstep. In that suffocating quiet, they expanded their operations to an unimaginable scale. The sanctum of generations became a factory of broken minds. Agatha began offering advanced interventions to wealthy men beyond Milbridge, merchants, judges, even members of the Massachusetts legislature. Word spread through secret letters and whispered conversations in Boston's smoky taverns. The Ashfords could fix any woman who threatened a family's reputation. In return, powerful patrons funneled gold, rare medicines, and political protection back to the convent, forging a pact of corruption that reached far beyond Milbridge's snowbound streets. Within the convent's walls, new horrors emerged. Prudence introduced a chamber called the Hall of Remorse, its walls etched with phrases like, "Obedience is salvation, and pain is purity." Here, captives were subjected to a ritual known as the Litany, a liturgical chant in which women were forced to recite confessions of every imagined sin, each repetition growing louder until it broke into hysterical screams. The litany didn't just force submission, it shattered any remaining sense of identity. In these moments, even the strongest spirits dissolved into hollow shells, ready to be remade. Outside, Millbridge transformed into a town of ghosts. Men who once sang in taverns now walked home in silence, clutching their coats against an invisible chill. Children grew pale and silent, taught from birth that questioning the convent meant death or worse. Rumors of entire families vanishing in the night became so common they were no longer discussed at church or market. Meanwhile, Agatha's ledgers swelled with new names and prices. Each entry, another soul purchased, another legacy blackened. She dreamed of a future where no woman in New England could raise her voice without permission, a continent subdued not by armies, but by fear so deep it would poison generations. And still, the snow fell, cloaking the land in white as if to hide the blood seeping into the earth around the convent. The Ashford curse had become more than a rumor. It was an empire, and it thrived in the silence of those too terrified to speak. As winter's grip tightened further, Millbridge ceased to resemble a living town at all. The streets grew empty even in daylight, curtains remained drawn, and the only sounds were the creaking of ice-laden branches and the low, mournful toll of the church bell, rung now only to mark the funerals of those who died in unexplained accidents or sudden, untraceable sickness. Behind the convent walls, Agatha's ambitions sharpened into something monstrous. She began experimenting with mass indoctrination, gathering groups of captives in the sanctum of generations and forcing them to witness each other's suffering. By chaining multiple women together, Prudence discovered that terror spread like contagion, amplifying their despair. Each sob became a catalyst, each shriek a wedge that drove deeper cracks into the group's collective mind. Agatha called these sessions the Choir of Silence, for when the chanting and weeping finally ceased, what remained was not peace, but the eerie quiet of utter surrender. Meanwhile, Temperance took her talents beyond the convent's halls, venturing into town under the guise of charitable work. She visited homes of influential families, offering gentle prayers over the sick or troubled. But with each visit, she sowed rumors that only unwavering loyalty to the sisters could keep loved ones safe. Mothers who once doubted the convent now begged to send their daughters for correction. Terrified of vague curses, Temperance hinted might fall upon those who hesitated. Dr. Hartwell watched all of this unfold with a growing sickness in his soul. What had started as curiosity, then professional pride, had become complicity in a horror he could no longer justify. Yet Agatha held him fast with threats of exposure. Every secret he had ever confided to her, every patient he had failed, recorded in meticulous detail. The thought of public ruin and execution silenced him more effectively than any chain. And so the Ashford sisters' influence grew deeper, their tentacles creeping into every decision made in Millbridge. Even the minister, a once fiery preacher, now stammered and paled when asked about the convent. At night, when storms howled over the frozen roofs, the sisters stood atop their tower, watching the dark forest with eyes full of ancient, patient hunger, knowing the town's silence was the truest proof of their victory. As March arrived with no sign of thaw, a restless unease settled over Millbridge like a curse etched into the frost. People spoke less, but their eyes darted more, as if every shadow might conceal one of the sisters' spies. And they weren't wrong. By now, Agatha had cultivated a network of informants among the townsfolk, men and women who owed their livelihoods, secrets, or safety to the convent. These watchers listened in taverns, leaned close in church pews, and reported every word of doubt or rebellion back to the sisters. It was said the Ashfords knew your thoughts before you dared speak them. Inside the convent, Agatha began planning for expansion. She envisioned new sanctums hidden in other towns, places where her methods could be perfected without the risk of discovery growing too great in a single location. She wrote letters under false names to wealthy men in Portland and Boston, proposing to open branches of spiritual healing in exchange for generous donations and discreet political favors. Meanwhile, Prudence perfected a new form of psychological torture she called the descent. Captives were led blindfolded down a spiraling staircase for hours, their steps deliberately uneven, each turn disorienting them further. By the time they reached the sanctum, their minds were so frayed by terror and confusion they could barely remember their own names. These women became the most pliable of all, their identities erased in a single nightmarish journey. Outside the convent, the forest itself seemed to twist in reflection of the sisters' corruption. Trees near the convent's borders grew stunted and gnarled, animals abandoned their dens, and hunters whispered of a foul scent that drifted on the night wind, the stench of decay masked by evergreen. The Ashfords' control over Millbridge was now absolute. Even the bravest townsmen, those who once spoke defiantly of liberty and righteousness, fell silent after a single summons to the convent's parlor. And at night, the sisters gathered in their candlelit tower, reading the names of the next women to be taken, each syllable rolling from their tongues like a dark prayer, for they knew the town's will was shattered, and that so long as fear ruled Millbridge, the Ashford curse would remain unchallenged, unbroken, eternal. As spring threatened the snow with the first weak rains of April, Millbridge's streets turned to rivers of slush, yet hope did not return with the thaw. If anything, the melting snow revealed what winter had hidden: scraps of torn dresses in the woods, dark stains in the frozen soil, and animal bones mixed with others suspiciously human. But the townsfolk looked away, choosing the blindness of fear over the agony of truth. Inside the convent, Agatha's obsession with total control reached a fever pitch. She now demanded nightly reports from every informant, reading each slip of parchment by candlelight while Prudence stood at her shoulder. Any hint of doubt, any whispered question about the sisters' miracles was swiftly addressed with a midnight visit from Temperance. She appeared at doors with a smile sweeter than spring flowers. But what came after her arrival left families mute with terror, and more women delivered to the convent's gates before dawn. In these late nights, the sisters' power became more than rumor. It was an infection in the town's very soul. Even those who tried to resist found themselves paralyzed by nightmares that seemed to bleed into waking life. Dreams of narrow stone corridors, of icy water closing over their faces, of chanting voices promising salvation through endless pain. In truth, Agatha had begun experimenting with a new form of manipulation, planting suggestions in captives' minds under heavy sedation, forcing them to speak the same words in their sleep night after night. These muttered mantras spread through families like a plague, passed from daughters to mothers to brothers until everyone in Millbridge unconsciously recited the Ashfords' dark doctrines. Meanwhile, the sanctum of generations grew more sinister. Prudence carved deeper into the bedrock, expanding the labyrinth of cells below the convent, creating chambers so remote the ear screams could never reach the surface. Here, women destined for complete erasure were taken, those whose spirits were deemed so defiant that only obliteration of their will would suffice. These captives emerged days or weeks later, eyes vacant, voices flat, stripped of every memory that made them who they once were. And so, as flowers began to push through the mud outside, Millbridge withered inside, a town dying beneath the weight of a curse that promised salvation, yet only delivered a legacy of madness and submission. As April turned to May and green buds unfurled across the forest, Millbridge's new season brought no relief. Only a deceptive mask of life draped over rot. The songbirds returned, but their cheerful notes rang hollow against the tense silence of the village. For by now, even the sound of laughter felt like a threat, a noise that might draw the Ashford sisters' gaze. Within the convent's walls, Agatha convened secret gatherings with her most trusted allies, a circle of influential men from surrounding settlements who had come to depend on her ability to correct the inconvenient women in their lives. These men arrived cloaked in darkness, their boots crunching softly on gravel as Temperance welcomed them with polite curtsies and carefully chosen words. In return for their loyalty and resources, Agatha promised them more than just obedience from their households. She promised them power itself, the power to mold their families, their communities, even their own futures, through the same methods she used in the sanctum of generations. And so a covenant of corruption was sealed, spreading the Ashford curse far beyond Millbridge's borders. Prudence, meanwhile, crafted a new phase of torment for the convent's captives: the reflection rite. In this ritual, women were forced to sit before enormous mirrors for days on end, forbidden to look away. Every hour, the sisters whispered accusations of imagined sins in their ears until the captives began to see monsters in their own reflections. twisted, hateful things they believed themselves to be. This hall of mirrors became a crucible for the destruction of identity, producing women who no longer trusted even the evidence of their eyes. Outside the convent, Millbridge's fields lay untended as farmers abandoned their plows to keep watch over their doors at night. Merchants refused to travel the forest roads, fearing what they might glimpse in the shadows. The town's children learned early that secrets were a kind of currency, and silence the only path to survival. And still, the sisters gathered nightly in their tower, eyes fixed on the dark tree line, whispering new names and refining their gospel of fear. For even as spring painted the land in bright greens and golds, Millbridge remained trapped in a perpetual winter of the soul, a place where hope dared not bloom, and the Ashford curse grew ever deeper roots in the darkness. By early June, the days grew long and bright, but in Millbridge, the light only cast sharper shadows across the convent's stone walls. The scent of lilacs drifted through town, masking the faint odor of decay that seemed to seep from the very earth around the convent. It was during these deceptively warm days that Agatha launched her most audacious manipulation yet. She began holding public sermons in the convent courtyard, inviting the entire town to witness what she called ceremonies of redemption. These gatherings were carefully staged displays of supposedly reformed women, pale, meek creatures who recited rehearsed confessions with flat voices before bowing to the sisters in gratitude. Agatha's words rang out like a prophet's, laced with poison, as she preached that Millbridge's salvation required absolute obedience to her sacred methods. Her sermons were a masterclass in control, weaving religious fervor with hints of mortal peril so skillfully that even those who sensed her evil dared not voice it. The ceremonies served another purpose too. They were a lure. Curious strangers from nearby towns came to see the spectacle, drawn by rumors of miraculous transformations. Some brought wives or daughters in hopes of a cure for disobedience or melancholy. Most never left Millbridge again, their arrival noted in Agatha's ledgers, their fates sealed in the labyrinth below the convent. Meanwhile, Prudence perfected a new terror, the baptism of silence. This ritual began with captives forced into an underground pool of icy water, held under just long enough to break their minds with panic. Then, soaked and shivering, they were led to the sanctum, where Temperance recited litanies of guilt until each woman's eyes went dull, her will washed away as surely as her breath. Outside, nature's lush beauty turned cruel, a mockery of the horror hidden behind the convent's fortress. Walls, fireflies danced above graves in the forest, and foxes unearthed bones that were quickly reburied by cloaked figures. And at night, as the moon painted the convent towers silver, Agatha stood in her candlelit study, poring over her maps of Maine, plotting new sites for expansion. For the Ashford curse was no longer content to feed on Millbridge alone. It had grown hungry enough to swallow the entire wilderness. By midsummer, Millbridge had become a place where even the sun felt sinister, its golden light exposing a town hollowed out by fear. The once bustling market square now stood deserted most days, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer replaced by the echo of lonely footsteps on cracked cobblestones. Rumors spread of entire families quietly disappearing, their homes left eerily untouched, dinner tables still set for meals that would never be eaten. Within the convent, Agatha's ambitions grew darker still. She began experimenting with a new tool she called the Mantle of Grace, a mask of polished ivory designed to cover a captive's face entirely, with only pinholes for breathing. Worn for days or weeks, the mask stripped captives of identity, forcing them to see themselves only as blank, faceless vessels. Agatha claimed it was an instrument of spiritual purification. In truth, it erased the last flickers of defiance from even the strongest minds. Temperance took on a new role, visiting the families of recent graduates. Women returned from the sanctum with empty eyes and perfect obedience. She praised the captives' transformations, praising the fathers and husbands for their faith in the sisters' methods, ensuring the town's complicity by flattering the very men who feared their own weakness most. Meanwhile, Prudence expanded the sanctum's archives, creating a library of broken souls. In meticulous journals, she recorded each captive's descent into submission. What words finally shattered them? What memories they surrendered first? Which tortures proved most effective? These records became a blueprint for future generations of control, ensuring the Ashford curse would never die with the sisters alone. And outside, the forest grew restless. Hunters reported wolves gathering in unnatural numbers along the convent's borders, their howls a nightly chorus that chilled even the most hardened men. Children dreamed of eyes watching from the tree line, nightmares so vivid they woke screaming. Yet their parents dared not comfort them with the truth, for the price of speaking out was too high. In the dark of night, the sisters gathered around an ancient oak in the convent's courtyard, chanting oaths to seal their legacy, and as the stars wheeled above them, Millbridge's fate was sealed ever tighter, each passing day sinking the town deeper into the Ashford sisters' cold embrace. By late July, the air in Millbridge hung heavy with the scent of rain and rot, each humid gust carrying whispers of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. The town's children played in the dusty streets under watchful eyes, their games hushed and joyless. Even the dogs grew silent, tails tucked as they skirted the convent's looming walls. Inside those walls, Agatha held nightly councils with Prudence and Temperance, poring over ledgers filled with names, dates, and sums of silver, a cold record of every transaction that had fed their growing empire of despair. Each entry marked another family broken, another woman reshaped into a compliant husk. It was during these councils that Agatha revealed her ultimate ambition, the creation of the Codex of Obedience, a single book compiling every lesson learned, every method perfected, a manual of psychological domination that could survive the sisters themselves. With it, the Ashford curse could endure beyond death, passed to chosen successors who would spread it like a disease across generations. To gather material for this grim tome, Prudence intensified the horrors in the sanctum. Captives were subjected to endless cycles of sensory deprivation, alternating with blinding lights and deafening hymns. Some broke in hours, others in days, but none emerged unchanged. Their shattered minds were carefully catalogued, their confessions transcribed by Temperance in a flowing hand that never wavered. Meanwhile, the ceremonies of redemption continued in the convent courtyard, now drawing larger crowds as rumors spread that Agatha's sermons could heal not just defiance, but sickness of the mind and body. Desperate families arrived from as far as Bangor, each new supplicant binding themselves unknowingly to the sisters' dark web. In Millbridge, quiet settled like a final shroud. Shops opened late and closed early, their keepers' eyes darting toward the convent with every gust of wind. At night, candles burned in windows not as symbols of welcome, but of fragile warding, as if light itself might repel the sisters' reach. And still the Ashfords plotted, confident that their power had become unassailable, that no force could break the silence now choking Millbridge. Above them, the stars turned coldly indifferent in the summer sky, bearing silent witness to a town slipping further from salvation with every passing night. By early August, the forest around Millbridge grew thick with mist each morning, curling through the trees like ghostly fingers reaching for the town. The mist seemed to linger longest near the convent, as if the very air conspired to hide the Ashfords' secrets. Those few brave enough to leave their homes before dawn reported hearing muffled sobs drifting from the woods, sounds that faded as the sun rose, leaving only a sickly stillness in their place. Inside the convent, the sisters prepared for what Agatha called the convergence, a grand ritual meant to bind every soul in Millbridge more tightly to their will. On the appointed night, they summoned every man, woman, and child to the convent courtyard under threat of eternal damnation for those who refused. Hundreds gathered under a sky churning with storm clouds, lightning flashing in the distance as Agatha took her place on a stone dais. Her voice rose like a hymn of doom as she declared the dawn of a new age, one where Millbridge would serve as the heart of a spiritual empire spreading from Maine to every corner of the fledgling United States. As rain began to fall, she led the townsfolk in chants of submission, words crafted to dismantle resistance and seal the townspeople's loyalty. Some chanted with fervor born of terror, others with hollow eyes, minds already lost to the sanctum's horrors. Prudence moved among the crowd with quiet menace, ensuring every voice joined in unison, while Temperance swayed with the rhythm, her eyes black pools of triumph. That night, something shifted irrevocably. The storm broke overhead as the final chant rose, thunder shaking the earth beneath the convent. When it ended, the silence was absolute. A dead, unnatural quiet that spread from the courtyard through every street and alley of Millbridge. In that hush, the Ashfords knew they had achieved a victory deeper than fear alone. He had uprooted the town's very sense of self, replacing it with a single unyielding truth, that the sisters' word was law, and to disobey was to forfeit not just life, but the soul itself. And so, as lightning faded and the rain slowed to a cold drizzle, Millbridge stood bound in the Ashford curse, a town whose heart no longer beat except by the will of 3 women who had learned to shape madness into power. In the days following the convergence, Millbridge's transformation became undeniable. Conversations grew rarer than birdsong, doors stayed barred even in daylight, and children learned to mimic their parents' wary silence. The town had become a husk, outwardly whole, but inside, every soul had been hollowed by fear. The Ashfords ruled unchallenged. Agatha moved through the streets like a sovereign, her black cloak sweeping the dirt as townsfolk dropped their eyes or fell to their knees at her passing. Each morning she reviewed reports from her spies, ensuring no whispers of dissent escaped her net. Those who dared question the sisters' teachings disappeared by nightfall, and by sunrise their families spoke only of tragic accidents or sudden illness. Meanwhile, Prudence oversaw the sanctum's unceasing work. The deeper levels had become a warren of misery, each cell occupied by captives in various stages of psychological collapse. Here, new methods were tested daily. Weeks of solitary confinement broken by brief, violent interrogations, nights spent in freezing water, days forced to crawl blindfolded through mazes lined with hidden blades. Each victim's reactions were meticulously noted in Temperance's ledger, adding new chapters to the growing codex of obedience. And outside the convent, Millbridge itself twisted to mirror its masters. The forest grew unnaturally quiet, as if even the animals feared the sisters' dominion. Crops withered without reason, but no one dared complain. The church bell fell silent after its ropes were found mysteriously severed one morning, and the town's old pastor left his pulpit forever, seen last, staggering into the woods with wild, haunted eyes. At night, strange figures cloaked in black walked the streets, slipping into homes uninvited to ensure each family recited the sisters' chants. When they departed, they left behind cold drafts and the scent of damp stone. The Ashfords' power had become total, and their ambitions turned outward once more. Agatha's gaze drifted beyond Millbridge, imagining a chain of sanctums across every state, a hidden empire of fear beneath the bright banners of the young republic. And in her candle-lit study, she began composing letters to distant cities, offering salvation to the powerful, knowing that the Ashford curse, once planted, could spread like rot through the heart of an entire nation. By mid-August, Millbridge seemed suspended in an endless twilight of dread. The sun rose and set, but the rhythms of normal life had ceased, replaced by a single relentless pulse, the will of the Ashford sisters. The market stalls stood empty, doors swung in the wind, and chimneys went cold as families rationed firewood, terrified of leaving home for even an hour. The convent itself had become a fortress of terror, its windows aglow each night with a sickly orange light as new ceremonies unfolded in the sanctum below. Within those walls, Prudence's experiments reached a cruel perfection. She introduced the echoing chamber, a cell lined with rough stone that amplified even the smallest sounds until captives' own breaths and heartbeats grew deafening. Left there for days, they emerged shattered, unable to speak without flinching, minds splintered by their own voices. Agatha, meanwhile, pursued a more subtle form of conquest. She began sending emissaries, women stripped of past identities and recast as sisters, into nearby towns with carefully crafted sermons. These envoys carried tales of miraculous healings and promises of salvation, gathering followers who returned to Millbridge willingly, eager to place themselves at the convent's mercy. Each new supplicant swelled the Ashfords' influence, feeding the codex with fresh lessons in fear. and in the shadows, Temperance cultivated an army of loyal children, taking the youngest captives and molding them into silent acolytes. These hollow-eyed youths moved through Millbridge unseen, listening at windows, watching from alleys, carrying back every whispered doubt to the convent's tower. Even the forest seemed to serve the sisters now. Hunters found game growing scarce near the convent, as if the animals sensed the unnatural order imposed on the land. And on moonless nights, villagers glimpsed shapes slipping through the trees. Tall figures with white masks glinting in starlight, guardians of the curse. Yet far beyond the forest, in distant settlements where Agatha's letters arrived, rumors began to spread of a sanctuary deep in Maine, where sinful women could be remade, where families could find peace through strict correction. And so the Ashford curse began to seep into the wider world, each whispered recommendation carrying a seed of darkness, promising a salvation that would devour all who sought it. As August gave way to September, the nights grew longer, cloaking Millbridge in a darkness that felt alive with secrets. The mist thickened with every dawn, curling through the town's crooked streets like a living veil, muffling the cries that still rose from the convent after midnight. The Ashford sisters moved with the confidence of queens, their every step a reminder that Millbridge belonged wholly to them. By now, the convent's sanctum had become a labyrinth of horror, new chambers carved deeper into the earth, each designed to test a captive's mind in a different way. Some rooms were entirely dark and silent. Others blared hymns on a constant loop until captives lost all sense of time and place. Every design was a note in Agatha's symphony of subjugation. Prudence continued to perfect her refinements, adding subtle cruelty to each ritual. In the Chamber of Reflections, captives were forced to watch distorted images of themselves projected on damp stone walls, their features twisted until they believed themselves demons deserving punishment. Many broke simply at the sight of their own monstrous reflection. Outside, Temperance expanded her network of spies among Millbridge's children. These young acolytes slipped into homes to plant small tokens, scraps of fabric embroidered with the sisters' sigil, reminders that the Ashfords saw everything. Each discovery deepened the town's paralysis, proving that there was nowhere safe, no thought private. At the convent gates, Agatha began welcoming guests from farther afield, minor officials, wealthy merchants, men who saw in her methods a promise of unchallenged control over their own households. They toured the sanctum under the guise of spiritual inquiry, and many left as allies, pledging funds or influence to spread the Ashfords' reach. Meanwhile, word of the Ashford women's miracles began to seep into port cities along the coast. Mariners carried stories of a convent deep in Maine where rebellious wives and daughters could be made meek. Though most scoffed, others listened. Powerful men who dreamed of absolute power behind closed doors. And so the curse slithered along trade routes and across tavern tables, sowing dread like seeds, ensuring the Ashfords' legacy could one day strangle more than just a single town lost among the pines. As September deepened, the forest around Millbridge took on an eerie quiet, the usual autumn songs of owls and night creatures replaced by a hush so profound it felt like the trees themselves were listening. The mist thickened each evening, crawling into homes through cracked windows, carrying the scent of damp stone and old blood. Inside the convent, Agatha finalized the first draft of the Codex of Obedience. Bound in dark leather and written in her own precise hand, it chronicled every discovery of the Ashford curse, the best methods for breaking wills, the timing of deprivation, the words that lodged deepest in a mind already fraying. This book was her true masterpiece, a weapon that could outlive flesh, ensuring their methods would spread long after their bones had turned to dust. Prudence celebrated its completion by inaugurating a new ritual she called the Chorus of Silence. In this rite, captives were lined up in the sanctum, each gagged and bound. For hours, they were forced to watch others be broken, absorbing terror in absolute silence until fear calcified into obedience. Those who dared whimper were dragged away to the echoing chamber, their punishment redoubled. Meanwhile, Temperance refined her training of the youngest acolytes. Under her tutelage, these children learned to mimic adult voices perfectly, to pen letters in the handwriting of abducted women, notes that soothed distant families into believing their loved ones were well. Each forged letter spread the Ashfords' illusion of benevolence a little farther, even as the truth rotted behind convent walls. Outside, Millbridge itself became a portrait of quiet decay. Weeds sprouted through cobblestones, doors sagged on broken hinges, and the old church collapsed in a storm one night without a soul daring to rebuild it. The forest grew bolder, its shadows creeping into the edges of town like black water, and each morning, a fresh layer of mist settled over Millbridge, thick enough to hide cloaked figures who came and went at the convent gates, emissaries and supplicants alike. The Ashford curse was no longer just a secret held in stone walls. It had become a living presence in every breath of Millbridge's stifled air, an invisible fog that twisted reality and promised the town's surrender was only the beginning. By late September, the first frosts of autumn began to wither what little life clung to Millbridge's gardens and fields. Each morning, the town woke to a crystalline glaze that made the convent's stone walls shimmer like a tomb in the pale light. Inside those walls, the sisters intensified their work, knowing winter would soon force all travelers to shelter. And any newcomers trapped by snow would find there was no leaving once the drifts grew high. Agatha called this season the binding time, when fear could be hammered deepest into the heart. She ordered daily processions through the streets. Captives in white robes and iron collars marched at dawn beneath the watchful eyes of the entire town. These spectacles hardened Millbridge's silence into stone. Neighbors turned away as the procession passed, each family too terrified to break the sisters' spell. Within the sanctum, Prudence unveiled her final chamber, the Hall of Echoes, a long corridor lined with mirrors etched in runes of twisted prayers. Here, captives were forced to crawl on hands and knees, seeing themselves multiplied in endless reflection. Every breath magnified to thunder, every whimper answered by a chorus of distorted voices. Few emerged from the hall with minds intact. Meanwhile, Temperance extended her reach into towns beyond Millbridge. She dispatched small groups of her child spies to settlements miles away, training them to watch travelers and whisper offers of salvation. Word spread of a place in the Maine wilderness that could fix any rebellious woman, heal any mental illness, or erase any shame. Each tale was carefully curated, carrying just enough truth to entice, just enough dread to silence questions. Back in Millbridge, the convent's bell rang nightly, summoning the faithful to the courtyard for Agatha's sermons. By torchlight, she spoke of a divine mission, of a world ruled by perfect obedience, where sin was a sickness only they could cure. Her voice rose like a knife slicing through the fog, promising peace to the loyal and annihilation to the doubters. And so, each night, Millbridge's people repeated her chants, their voices flat and dead, their eyes reflecting the torchlight like glass. The Ashford curse had transcended the sisters' walls, seeping into the hearts of every man, woman, and child, a legacy of madness now woven into the fabric of the land itself. By October's first days, the winds turned bitter, and the forest surrounding Millbridge howled each night with a voice that seemed almost human. The fog grew so dense it choked lantern light, turning the streets into tunnels of shifting gray. The convent's black stone rose above it all like a monument to despair, the final refuge of the sisters' dominion. Inside, Agatha began preparations for what she called the Night of Binding Stars, a ritual designed to seal Millbridge's fate forever. She claimed the constellations would align to grant her power over every soul caught in the Ashford curse, and she ordered the construction of an altar atop the convent's tower, where the town could see her silhouette framed by the heavens. Prudence perfected her tools for the ritual, twisted brands and scalpels etched with sigils meant to mark captives as belonging to the sisters' eternal flock. Temperance, meanwhile, oversaw rehearsals for the night's procession, training children to chant phrases in languages they did not understand, but that made even hardened men tremble. As the appointed night approached, the sisters sent letters to powerful men across New England, inviting them to witness the ceremony. Some came eagerly, eager to see obedience made manifest. Others came skeptically, only to leave Millbridge days later as converts, carrying the Ashfords' dark gospel back to their cities. On the night itself, the sky cleared with unnatural swiftness, stars gleaming cold and bright over the tower. Agatha's voice rose above the town, carried by the still air, words promising salvation through surrender, power through suffering, glory through unquestioning loyalty. Below, the townsfolk knelt in muddy streets, eyes fixed on the black spire as torches guttered around them. At the ritual's climax, a cry of anguish split the silence, the first of many as captives were branded on the altar, their screams ringing across Millbridge. The townspeople did not look away. They bowed lower, their spirits crushed by the spectacle. From that night on, something in Millbridge broke beyond repair. An emptiness settled in every home, a hollow acceptance of the sisters' absolute rule. The Ashford curse had become a covenant sealed by blood and starlight, binding not only the bodies but the very souls of all who dwelled within the mist-choked borders of their doomed town. In the days following the night of binding stars, Millbridge drifted through life like a ghost town, its people moving with mechanical obedience, eyes vacant, voices hollow. The convent bell tolled at dawn and dusk, each chime a reminder that the Ashford curse ruled every heartbeat within the fog-bound streets. Even the forest seemed to obey. The mist no longer wandered but stood still, a motionless sea of white that swallowed any who tried to flee. Within the convent, Agatha's ambitions grew ever more audacious. She began writing letters to church authorities in Boston and New York, cloaking her dark purpose in the language of piety. She offered alliances with powerful clergy, promising a model of perfect spiritual discipline that could pacify entire congregations. Some recipients scoffed. Others, intrigued by whispers of the sisters' success, replied with cautious interest, drawn by the promise of control over restless flocks. Prudence, emboldened by the success of the Night of Binding Stars, embarked on her most disturbing experiment yet: the Choir of Mirrors. Captives were chained in a circle of angled glass, forced to watch each other's torments endlessly reflected, their own screams magnified until they fused into a single, inhuman wail. Few survived the ordeal with minds intact, and those who did emerged as fervent disciples, their personalities erased, their loyalty absolute. Temperance, meanwhile, oversaw a network of children who now carried messages between Millbridge and distant towns. These child couriers were blank-eyed shadows, slipping unnoticed through inns and market squares, planting rumors of a miraculous sanctuary where sin could be purged and disobedience erased. Each tale they told was a lure, baiting new families into the Ashfords' waiting jaws, and so the curse spread beyond Millbridge, one quiet whisper at a time, carried on autumn winds that addled dead leaves through empty streets. The sisters' reach had grown from a single convent to a web of influence snaking across Maine, each thread pulling tighter around hearts desperate for easy answers. And above it all, the convent loomed in silent triumph, the tower's altar still stained with the blood of the branded, a black beacon calling lost souls to the promise of salvation through perfect, unthinking submission. By mid-October, the forest had gone silent as a grave, its last leaves fallen like shrouds across the frozen ground. Each dawn, Millbridge woke to skies the color of lead and air so cold it bit the lungs. But worse than the creeping winter was the knowledge that the Ashford curse had seeped into every corner of their lives. At the convent, Agatha convened councils with influential men who traveled from afar, each seeking the sisters' secrets of control. The convent's halls echoed with quiet negotiations, promises of alliances, whispered plans to establish sanctums in other towns, even discussions of how to reshape entire communities through systematic terror. Agatha spoke with the calm certainty of a queen whose rule had become destiny. In the sanctum below, Prudence continued her relentless refinement of suffering. She introduced a new method she called the silence of mirrors, a solitary cell lined with mirrored walls where captives saw themselves staring back from every angle. Days spent in this chamber dissolved identity, until prisoners could no longer distinguish themselves from the reflections. A fracturing of mind so complete that even their thoughts became foreign. Meanwhile, Temperance trained a cadre of older acolytes, youths who had graduated from spying to more active roles. These blank-faced adolescents ventured into surrounding towns, offering testimonies of miraculous healing to skeptical fathers or promising to cure wives of disobedience. They carried tokens, iron rings stamped with the Ashford sigil, which they claimed guaranteed a place in the convent's sacred program. Each ring was a snare, each word a hook sinking into the hearts of those who longed for power over their families. And so the Ashford curse's roots dug deeper, spreading with every quiet exchange in a roadside inn or hushed conversation at a market stall. Back in Millbridge, the Sista, or as processions grew grander and crueler, their chants echoing down deserted streets as the townsfolk marched with lowered heads, bound to a faith born of terror. The convent's tower became a lighthouse of dread, its black stone catching the wan light of a dying autumn sun. A signal to all who still dreamed of control that the Ashford women offered not salvation, but the certainty of absolute, merciless dominion. As October waned into November, the first snows fell over Millbridge, blanketing the town in a hush even deeper than before. The forest's bare branches clawed at a sky perpetually gray, and the convent's tower loomed like a monolith over a landscape frozen in fear. Within those black walls, the Ashford sisters gathered in their candle-lit sanctum for what Agatha declared the culmination of their work, the final binding. By the flickering light, she read aloud the completed Codex of Obedience, her voice resonating with a power that seemed to warp the very air. Each word she spoke felt heavier than iron, each phrase driving the townsfolk further into a stupor of absolute surrender. As Agatha intoned the final lines, Prudence and Temperance led the captives, and willing townsfolk alike, into a procession circling the convent's tower. The sisters' chants rose in a crescendo of ancient syllables, words older than the New England woods themselves, a liturgy of control that bound every mind in earshot. Those who heard it found their thoughts slowing, their wills dissolving until nothing remained but the compulsion to obey. Above, the stars vanished behind roiling clouds as if the heavens themselves turned away. Below, Millbridge's streets grew crowded with kneeling figures, their faces lifted to the tower's altar, eyes glazed with perfect devotion. At midnight, the sisters raised their arms over the gathered mass, declaring the Ashford curse complete. From that moment, Millbridge was no longer a town but a single breathing entity, every heart beating to the sisters' rhythm, every soul shackled by their whispered litany. And as the snow piled higher, the Ashfords' emissaries departed in all directions, carrying copies of the Codex to distant cities. In each, a seed of the curse would be planted, a promise of peace through absolute control, a future where obedience was not requested but demanded. The Ashford curse had become a living force, a legacy of madness and mastery poised to spread far beyond the frozen woods of Maine. And for those who dared seek the truth, the legend endures, a whisper on winter winds, a warning of a convent that offered not salvation, but an inheritance of darkness that would forever change and forever claim any man who learned its name.